Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Okay, our guests joining us for this edition of the Spotlight are Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, who joins us from Bethlehem, New York. Also joining us is Yousof Azizi, Iranian affairs expert, who joins us from Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome to you both. Yousof Azizi, let me first start with you. So Iran Government Week, the President Ibrahim Raisi has spoken, and one of the most important parts relating to the topic of this program, the revival of the Iran nuclear deal, is the issue of the settlement of safeguards, which he has said between Tehran and the International Atomic Energy Agency has to be done in order for an agreement to really come into fruition. What are your thoughts on the statements he made there?
Yes, as far as we know, there are three main issues that obstacles for reaching an agreement, and those are the guarantees that Iran needs to, that the next administration of the United States also committed under this JCPOA, the sanction relief that many entities and person under President Trump maximum pressure put under the sanctions. So Iran wanted to make sure that it get the benefits from the deal. And also the second one is to close these file against Iran nuclear program, which is monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And without those three issues that resolve, any agreement would not be sustainable for the long term. So Iran, for the two first issues, Iran compromised on the last statement, on the final text of the European proposal. And Iran now asks for the other side to also their compromise on the third one, which is the files near the IAEA, to settle down all of those after before they reach to the final term of the agreement. So if the file is still open behind the IAEA, so there is a possibility that the United States or other parties under the JCPOA, they use it or misuse it against Iran to don't let Iran, prevent Iran to get the benefit it is legitimately should get.
Scott Ritter, this is what Iran's envoy to the IAEA, Kazem Gharibabadi, has said about this issue. The agency's report is not credible about those three sites where the alleged uranium traces, as they're portraying it to be. The agency's report is not credible because it's not based on reliable sources. It's also not convincing because it doesn't reflect all of the dimensions of cooperation and yielded progress. Tell us how there is a premise that the IAEA is portraying for Iran to have swayed into a dimension that would be against either what the IAEA is assuming to be the 2015 agreement, or that Iran is moving towards weaponization. It's giving that type, it's basically portraying Iran to not be playing in a good character here. And of course, Iran is now saying we have to close this file completely. Do you give Iran a right for that? How do you see it?
Well, first of all, this is not a new issue. I mean, it's none of the issues being brought up by the IAEA are reflective of current realities. They're all historical in nature, and they've been dealt with previously. One of the aspects of the 2015 agreement was that the Iranian government and the International Atomic Energy Agency would close the door through negotiation, through discussion, through dialogue, through investigation on what they called the past military dimensions of Iran's program, the suspicions that Iran had been at one time pursuing a military program. These suspicions had their origins in Israeli intelligence, which was leaked to the International Atomic Energy Agency on multiple occasions in the early 2000s. Many of the documents that were leaked were shown to be forgeries, and others just had no basis in reality. And this issue was closed. I mean, that was one of the preconditions for moving on with the implementation of the JCPOA, is that these possible military dimension issues would be put to rest. But now, because Donald Trump withdrew from the the JCPOA, and he withdrew, by the way, after being briefed by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on a new archive, a nuclear archive that Israeli intelligence uncovered in a dramatic raid on Tehran, taking away, hundreds, thousands of documents. Many of which, by the way, were the same documents that Israel tried to feed the IAEA back in 2004, 2005. So it makes you wonder about the veracity of the Israeli claim. But Trump acted on this, and now, as we're trying to move, the international community are trying to move towards a resumption of the JCPOA, Israel is once again using these archives to generate doubt about Iran's intent. Iran has every right to say stop, cease, desist. How many times can the IAEA be fooled? How many times can the IAEA, pretend that Israel is suddenly imbued with righteous accuracy? Israel has been shown over the course of history to fabricate documents, to lie, to do anything necessary to sow doubt in the minds of the international community about Iran's program. The reality is there's no evidence that Iran has ever pursued a nuclear weapons program, and there's no evidence that Iran is pursuing it today. And Iran has every right to say, we're not going to play this game. If you want to go forward with the agreement that we reached in 2015, the agreement that was based upon the closure of this issue previously, then you got to close it again today. We're not going to play that game. Iran has every right to say this.
Well, I mean, when you take a look at what happened pretty recently, Yousof Azizi, that was the trip that Rafael Grossi made to Israel. And of course, you know what happened after that. Basically, that just shows Iran how Israel is playing a role, and it also pushes the IAEA, not that it didn't before with other factors, but pushes the IAEA into a realm of being not technically operating, but rather becoming political in this issue. How can that be stopped? How can Iran actually address that so there's not going to be any opposition or any crisis coming up later were there to be a deal? If that happened.
Well, I think one of the
this
most
will be for
important
Yousof
things
Azizi. I'm sorry, Scott Ritter. Go ahead, Yousof Azizi.
Yeah, as you said, Iran was angry about the act of Rafael Grossi on tripping to went to Israel and then put the Iran's file in the IAEA Board of Governance and issue a resolution against Iran on that manner. So, but on the other hand, we know that it is claimed that IAEA is a technical, international agency. But at the end, if the superpower and the world powers acted politically, the director of the IAEA should, obey on that. So the fact that the other guests also told about that in 2015, when JCPOA was signed, the precondition is that all of the that accusation against Iran nuclear program should be completely ended. And we know that previously the previous director of IAEA, he traveled to Iran, to Parchin, and did whatever they wanted to do to finish all of this issue. And again, at that time, Israel and some member of the Congress, United Congress, they claim against whatever the IAEA did. But it is politically resolved. And here also Iran asked a legitimate question, and I said a legitimate demand, that if you want deal to be sustained in the future, you have to close all of these accusations against Iran. And you could do. The United States is the only country that now it is not in agreement with European Union, with Russia, with China, and Iran to close these files and accusations against Iran before the deal was signed.
Well, this is what's confusing, Scott Ritter, and the capacity that you have, technically oriented, I'm assuming, and of course the knowledge that you have. Isn't Rafael Grossi playing with words to portray something that may allude to something else that's negative? For example, on June 6th of this year, nuclear watchdog saying Iran is a few weeks away from having a significant quantity of enriched uranium. And then he goes on to say a significant quantity does not mean having a bomb. One example. Another example of playing with words, defining significant quantity of enriched uranium as the approximate amount of nuclear material for which there's a possibility of manufacturing a nuclear explosive device that cannot be excluded. These are his words. So when you hear that, Iran is obviously keen to understanding that that's not true. But why then does he continue with the way that he's presenting things in a negative realm, so to speak?
Well, he's basically working off of the Israeli brief. The Israeli brief is that Iran's nuclear program, in any capacity, is a threat to Israel because it provides the potential for Iran to produce a nuclear weapon. The mere fact that Iran is capable of enriching uranium, again, low-level uranium, mid-level, high-level, it doesn't matter. As long as Iran can enrich it, it has the potential to, create enough fissile material to produce a nuclear weapon. Therefore, when Israel speaks of Iran and a nuclear weapons program, it automatically includes Iran's indigenous uranium enrichment program, even though that program is well documented as being exclusively for civilian use. And the Director General of the IAEA knows this. This is why it's irresponsible for him to be speaking in this manner. It's someday in the future, if the JCPOA comes back in, all the sunset clauses are going to be lifted. Iran will be able to install and operate advanced centrifuges and stockpile enriched uranium sufficient to produce fuel for a multitude of peaceful nuclear power reactors that Iran plans to build. At that time, one should be saying this is evidence of Iran's intent to pursue a peaceful nuclear program. But to use the current thinking of the IAEA Director General, Iran will have accumulated sufficient quantity of enriched material that would permit it to produce multiple nuclear devices should it decide to do so. See how you spin that? That's the Israeli spin. And this proves that Israel has the ear and the mind of the current leadership of the IAEA.
And one of the things not mentioned, Yousof Azizi, is the alarm bells that are rung by the IAEA or even by Israel or by the media. I'm so tempted to name this particular media organization, but I'm going to refrain from doing it because it has just come up with so many really false news about this whole thing. Anyways, the alarm bells ringing when it was announced 60% fissile purity from 20% is what Iran has pursued. Iran has come out, and this is one thing that's overlooked, which you can expand more, is that one of the main applications, by the way, Ali Akbar Salehi, the former head of Iran's atomic energy program, has said that simultaneously Iran can do this. This is when Natanz was attacked, and that's a whole other story. But one of the things that Iran has said, one of the main applications of 60% enriched uranium, radiopharmacology. It's working on radiopharmaceuticals for this, which has medical purposes. There's so many other things related to nuclear technology other than the bomb that they keep reflecting on Iran, isn't there?
Yes, that's perfectly true. So as you know, the Iran nuclear program first revised, but the nuclear reactor of Tehran that received as a gift by United States previously about 60 years ago, it works with the uranium enrichment of over 90%. Okay, so any nuclear technology program has a double use. It's civilian and also the military use. So what happened in Iran is that, and it is very important for Iran, is that the United States has a choice. If Iran develop its current nuclear program without monitoring the additional protocol, you know that Iran abandoned the additional protocol months ago, that some of the cameras that IAEA has in Iran that doing online monitoring, all of them take off from Iranian nuclear program. There is a choice for United States. Either Iran develop its current nuclear program without monitoring, or coming back to the JCPOA and put aside the previous documents against Iran, accusation against Iran. This is the choice that United States has. And the problem here is in the Washington, D.C. It is about domestic politics of the United States, the coming election in the United States, and the fact that United States doesn't show any flexibility to reach to the agreement with Iran.
You talked about Israel, Scott Ritter, earlier on, and we need to expand a little bit more on that because Israel is still relentlessly pushing for a possible agreement to not happen. Now, that has been accompanied by Israeli threats, of which Iran's President Raisi dismissed that in this conference that was held today of Iran Government Week, emphasizing that nobody can deprive the Iranian nation of its inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology. What do you make of the Israeli military threats against Iran at this juncture? Is the audience there the U.S.?
First of all, let's just start off with what I believe is a statement of reality. Israel is not in a position to initiate or sustain an airstrike of sufficient quality and quantity necessary to have a meaningful degradation of Iran's nuclear program. So, and the Israeli military knows this. Their Air Force knows this. Their general staff knows this. Their political leaders know this. They also know that if they initiate such an attack, Iran has credible retaliatory capabilities in the form of precision-guided missiles that can inflict significant harm on Israel, that there would be a price to be paid by Israel that would be devastating economically, militarily, geopolitically, domestically. So we're not talking about reality when we speak of an Israeli attack on Iran. It's not real. It's fictional. It's done for political purposes. It's done to assuage an Israeli population that has been programmed to fear an Iranian nuclear weapon. And it's done to put pressure on the United States to act in a more stringent fashion in terms of confronting the potential of an Iranian nuclear weapon, threatening the United States that Israel would start something that the United States would have to finish. So I think that's what's going on here. And, this is one of the reasons why President Biden visited Israel on his last Middle East trip, to sit down with the Israelis and talk about, how the United States would be there with Israel should Iran pursue a nuclear weapons program, that the military option was there. And that's the purpose of the Israelis. The purpose of the Israelis speaking like this is to put political pressure on the United States to send a signal to the Israeli people. That's what this is about, politics. To the Israeli people that if Iran were to pursue a nuclear weapon, that the United States would have Israel's back. That's what's going on here. There's not a real threat of an Israeli strike against Israel. What there is the threat of ongoing covert action by Israel, the assassination of Iranian scientists, covert attacks on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. This has happened and will probably continue to happen if even after the JCPOA is signed. And this is problematic. This is where the United States has to exert some leadership and tell the Israelis, as Barack Obama told the Israelis back in 2015, to cease and desist, that if there's going to be a meaningful agreement, that agreement must be allowed to run its course without the kind of undermining that Israeli covert action brings.
Sure, and you have that's a great point. You have all this going on in terms of the talks, Yousof Azizi, and then you have coincidentally the NPT conference. And it's quite ironic, isn't it, that you have Israel that's not a party to the NPT or a member. Iran has slammed the NPT conference actually for refusing to call on Israel to join the NPT. Isn't Israel afraid that Iran might just say, forget the NPT? This is not an official stance of Iran, by the way. But I'm just guessing when with military threats and acts of sabotage that that Scott Ritter just stated, isn't Israel looking at that aspect, that may happen if it continues at the path, this aggressive approach towards Iran, which also includes obviously false statements that it gives to the IAEA?
Yeah, as you said, so the current situation, international relation between what Israel is doing in nuclear program and Iranian doing nuclear program is a hypocrisy in international relation. But on the other hand, even Javad Zarif, the former Iran foreign minister, who is willing to negotiate and engage with the Western countries, after the President Trump withdrew United States from the deal, he said that Iran has 3 options to do in order to combat this issue. And the third one is to exit from NPT. So I mean that exiting from NPT is an option for Iran, but it is the last option for Iran if Iran finds that, okay, the Western countries, the United States, they are not really willing to resolve this issue. They just wanted to play with us. And if this is something that all of the Iranian decision maker reached that point, so it might be an option for Iran to come out of the NPT and do in the final stage. But as you said,
Sure.
this is not the official yet. It is not the official stage for Iran.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time, but thank you for that, Yousof Azizi, Iranian affairs expert from Washington, D.C. Scott Ritter, thank you, former UN weapons inspector from Bethlehem, New York. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. Comments, please do send them newsroom@presstv.ir. From Mikhail and the team, it's goodbye until next time.